So have you ever thought about like when you have sort of a like when so you have basically there's this whole like back when we used when we used to have this whole like when there was that back when we What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today we have a bit of an interesting topic that I want to dig into. This is actually coming out of a survey that Blizzard has, at least as I'm told, sent out to a whole bunch of players, well, at least to one player that I know of, who then sent it to me, talking about some potential ideas for updates and changes for Classic in the future. And because we've been talking about Classic a lot here on the show for a while, and specifically bringing up the idea of Classic Plus a lot, I thought it'd be interesting to sort of dig into the idea of what would Blizzard specifically be thinking about. And since we have this list of essentially ideas that was ostensibly part of this survey, that makes a very good opportunity to sort of dig into that a little bit and see what we can think about that. Now, before we continue, I want to clarify a few things here. This, again, was sent to me by a viewer. I was not invited to this survey by Blizzard. This is something that a viewer just took a couple of screenshots of, like, essentially a list of topics and sent those to me. Now, in the past, Blizzard has asked for confidentiality in a lot of the surveys like this, but more recently, they've been dropping that off a lot. There's actually been a few surveys that I know of sent out more recently where they don't ask for confidentiality at all. And that's becoming much more common around the entire gaming industry because these developers sort of realize, yes, we still need to do these surveys, but we know someone's going to leak it anyway. So why add that extra layer of, oh, don't tell anyone about this, because it's kind of like unnecessary for a lot of things at this point. So I don't know if there was a confidentiality agreement in place for this survey or not, because it's much more common for there to not be those these days. That's the reason that I feel comfortable even talking about it here on the show. Regardless, what that means is that we're missing a lot of the context for this. I don't have this survey myself. It was not sent to me by Blizzard, which means the entirety of the survey and the specifics of how they ask questions throughout that, assuming that the survey even exists in the first place. I don't have any reason to believe that the person who sent me this is lying, but again, I don't have any of that context myself. So just making you aware of what my role in this whole situation is and the amount of knowledge that I have. I literally just have this list of features that Blizzard is potentially considering for Classic in some capacity. And I thought at the very least it would make a good list of talking points to go through, because a lot of what they mention in this list of topics is the sort of thing that sprouts some good sort of like theorizing and speculation and consideration of what would these changes even be like if they were ever added into Classic. I also want to throw a quick reminder that this is all just my opinions about what sort of game I personally would like to play. If the version of Classic that I want to play is different from the version of Classic that you want to play, then that's totally fine. Like, I fully respect that there are people who have a different opinion and a different desire to play just a different form of Classic. Like the whole 40 player versus 20 player rating thing for me. I have zero interest in doing 40 player rating in a Classic environment, but I still want to play that Classic content. So for me, I don't want 40 player rating to be a thing, even in Season of Discovery. But a lot of people have made very valid arguments to the contrary of why they like that larger scale of groups. They like that more, aside from the people organizing the thing, more casual atmosphere overall, because you kind of just have to show up and do like whatever your unique job is in the whole thing. You're not like, the whole raid isn't hinging on one person all that often. A lot of people like that environment, and they very rightly have noted that Classic Era is the only place where 40 player rating still even really exists in honestly any MMO that I'm aware of at this point, aside from maybe some other like super old school MMOs that are still around. So that's a perfectly valid viewpoint and opinion. I'm just all saying this to note that as we go through this list, these are all just my opinions on what game I would like to play. If that is not your opinion, that's perfectly fine, and I respect that. In fact, I would love to hear what your opinions are. If you want to leave a comment, if you disagree with anything in here, or if you want to echo something that I said, or have your own thoughts that you'd like to contribute, please do leave a comment. Let me know what you think. But in fact, on that note, the last thing that I want to point out before we start digging into this list of topics is that there are a few points in here that mention Classic Era specifically. To me, Classic Era is the term used for the like original, as close to 2004 level 1 through 60 Classic experience that there was. Trying to, as best as possible, with only a few minor changes here and there, make it as much the game that it was in 2004 and recreate that today. To me, that's what Classic Era is. And I just want to be clear. I think that should always exist. I think there should always be a version of Classic that is as true to the original as possible. I don't mind a few little like quality of life exclusively. In fact, there's a question that we're going to get to at the end of this episode that goes into this a little bit as well. I don't mind a few like quality of life level changes in there, things like the Chrono Boon, which were things that were put in place just so that people who wanted to play Classic could feel like they could safely go and play Classic without losing their raid buffs. They didn't have to literally like make alts to play the game on, or like just play, get their raid buff and then log off so that they could have their raid buff for the next time they go through. And there's a whole big thing we can get into that about parsing culture and how that has affected the way that Classic plays and why that exists in the first place. I'm not going to get down that tangent today. But I think things like the Chrono Boon are good responses to the way Classic is played in 2024 that have upheld the integrity of the way the game originally played. But to that point, no matter what, I think there should be a version of Classic Era that exists that is as true to the original experience as possible. But enough disclaimers and setting the stage for all of this discussion. Let's actually get into it. The first one on the list that I want to talk about is the first one on the list, incidentally. And I was glad to see this one on top of the list because I just did a video about this like three and a half weeks ago at this point. And that concept is new or unexplored storylines and lore. And the description is never before seen quests that are new to World of Warcraft Classic. And like I said, I did a video about this about 3.5 weeks ago. I really, really love this for Classic. I think this is a great I think Classic in general is a great opportunity for Blizzard to go back and just put some little things here and there. It doesn't need to be like a huge, like, expansion level quest line where you're going to brand new zones or there's whole new, like, villains being introduced and stuff like that. I mean, a villain or two here and there would be fine. But we don't need to have like full on, like, here's a new world crisis being put into the game sort of stuff. I think to me, the biggest thing about Classic is, and one of the biggest reasons that I gravitate towards Classic, even in 2024, is that it's an MMO where it feels like you're exploring a world. It's an MMO where it feels like you are surrounded by any million other things that are going on. And you as the player get to have your adventure of going around that world and finding these different little things that are occurring and finding all these little tasks that you can accomplish and ways you can help people, ways you can hinder people, and so on. You get to go around the world and experience it as a world, as opposed to a direct narrative experience, which just is like, I don't have a problem with a direct narrative experience. I don't have a problem with the way that WoW tells stories in 2024, how the modern game tells stories. I don't have a problem with that at all. I think that's good for that game. But I think for Classic, a big part of that vibe is that sense of exploration, and that sense of being immersed into a world where there's a million things going on, and they're not all interconnected. They're not all leading towards one big narrative arc where there's one big bad guy at the end of it that you have to defeat. There's just a ton of stuff going on because it's a world. It feels lived in. It feels alive to me. And I think having new and unexplored storylines and lore, as they put it, inside of the Classic environment is a great way to expand on that, keep that Classic vibe as much as possible, while still allowing for the possibility of some new stuff that you haven't seen before. But again, I did a whole video on that, like I said, about 3.5 weeks ago. You can go back and check that video if you want a more complete understanding of what exactly I'm talking about. We're going to move on. The next one on the list is new reputations and rewards, with the description being introduction of new factions to build reputation that unlocks new rewards. And this bullet to me is kind of a giant question mark. Like, I don't have a problem with the concept of new reputations. I don't have a problem with the concept of new rewards. To me, a reputation is literally just like, it's literally just a gameplay hook, right? It's literally just a form of progression, a form of measuring progression. So to me, saying new reputation and rewards is about the same as saying new ways to earn experience points. Like, that's such a broad and wide topic that it doesn't really mean anything to me. Again, I was told by the person that sent this in that a lot of these questions went into greater detail through the actual survey. So I'm sure there is much more that's going on with this one. As it is, it's difficult for me to really examine from a like direct perspective, but I don't have a problem, like I said, with new reputations and rewards, like the Warden's reputation that's been added to Season of Discovery. I thought that was fine. The incursions ended up falling a little bit flat overall for me, but it was fine having a nice little relatively easy rep grind in there that you were able to get some rewards from. Things like I didn't even have a problem with the whole Azeroth Commerce Authority / Duratar trading. I forget exactly what the Horde version of that reputation was called. Didn't have a problem with that directly either. The problem I had was with the crates. The crates have just been, to me, kind of a miss from start to finish. But I guess that's generally my thoughts on new reputations and rewards. It would depend entirely on how they are implemented and what the actual gameplay hook of gaining that reputation is. If it's something as simple as like go grind this bunch of mobs and then eventually you get something, that actually feels fairly classic to me. I wouldn't have a problem with that at all, especially if maybe that new reputation and that grinding those mobs was tied to like a new dungeon or something that you could go do. I think there's lots of ways this sort of stuff could be implemented. To me, it's more about, yeah, sure, I'm open to the idea. I'm fine with the concept of adding new reputations and rewards. It's really about down to the implementation and what you actually do to earn this stuff. That's the point where it really starts to ask questions for me. We'll do the next two together. There is new or reimagined raids, and then new or reimagined dungeons. Basically, the concept of should there be more group instanced content or reimagined instance content inside of Classic. And again, this one does say within Classic era. I don't think they should go to the like almost museum version at this point of World of Warcraft. I don't think they should go back and rewrite Classic era itself. I generally would prefer that Classic era be mostly left alone. Again, I'm fine with a few like little quality of life changes, things like the Chrono Boon, but I don't want that to be something where they go, hey, let's go through Classic era Molten Core and update it to be like it is in Season of Discovery. No, leave that Molten Core as it is as a 40-player raid. But assuming that we're talking about something that doesn't replace that version of Classic era, this is something new, the concept essentially of a Classic Plus server, then yes, I'm absolutely all for both of these things. I think reimagining some of those old raids and sort of plussing them up a bit so that they have something more to them than just, do you remember where your decurse button is? Do you know how to not stand in fire? Like even fights like Cthulhu, which is an incredibly strict fight on 40 players in terms of positioning and so on. But even fights like that are relatively simple compared to a lot of modern MMO and modern WoW fights. And I don't think they should aim to be as complex as some of the modern fights, just to be absolutely clear. I'm not asking for mythic rating, like Dragonflight mythic rating to exist inside of Classic. I think that would be a bad idea. But there's a lot of fights that at the very least could you, and Cthulhu, by the way, is not on the list of what I'm talking about. I think Cthulhu is fine. But I'm talking about the idea of there's a lot of fights where I think just giving it another mechanic or two so they're not boring would be nice. A lot of what I mentioned earlier, the whole concept of parse culture, a lot of why that came about is because there kind of isn't much else to really focus on. There isn't much else to really strive for inside of Classic rating in a lot of ways for a lot of people. So it ends up coming down to, okay, how fast can we actually kill this boss? It almost becomes a speed run of sorts. And I don't think that necessarily needs to change, but it could be a more interesting speed run and be more, I don't know, in the moment having fun than just like straight up going through your DPS rotation and hoping to push as many buttons as you possibly can. I think it'd be fine to add another mechanic or two to certain fights here and there. Same goes for dungeons. There's a few of them where it's just every boss that you come to is just a straight up tank and spank. It's like, okay, this is a boss technically, but all they do is they have more health and they hit a little bit harder than the trash mobs you cleared to get to them. So again, I don't have a problem with buffing that stuff up a little bit, giving a few more interesting things here and there, and updating some of the loot a little bit as well. I think those are good changes that can occur to Classic that will still sort of keep the vibe of Classic and how it worked intact, but different ways to, just make it a little bit more interesting. And as to the concept of new raids and new dungeons, yes, absolutely. Like I was talking before about the new and unexplored storylines, I think hooking in some new raids or dungeons to those unexplored storylines would be a great way to tie all that together. It'd be a great way to give players more to do inside of the Classic sort of paradigm. I'm just very much in support of all of this stuff. We're going to do the next couple together as well, because my answer to them is very similar for both. This is the concept of new or future races pulled back. And then the concept of new or future classes pulled back. And the description for both of these is pretty much the same. Introducing races or classes, from WoW's expansions to Classic era. Again, the whole thing about Classic era being left alone, make this a new thing, make this a Classic Plus or whatever. Just reminder of all of that as we're talking about this. But my thoughts on this one is, honestly, it depends on the race. It depends on the class. I think it would be weird for like Drakthir evokers to turn up in Classic without the Dragon Isles being around. Like, why are these guys here? Where do they come from? What's going on with this? That's a little bit weird. I think it would depend on, and to that point as well, actually, I think there's possibility for some races that don't exist in the modern game for various reasons, to then exist inside of classic era, and probably some fan favorites as well. Like the one that immediately pops to mind for me is High Elves. Obviously, in the modern game, we have both Blood Elves and Void Elves, and those basically are what's left of the High Elves, right? Like there's probably a few characters still kicking around somewhere that could be called a High Elf because they decided not to follow Kael'thas Sunstrider, and also didn't get caught up in the whole Void thing. So there's probably some characters around that still fit that description. But as far as a playable race, if you were to add High Elves at this point, like what would the difference be between a well customized Void Elf or a well customized Blood Elf? Like honestly, you can make a Blood Elf that just is a High Elf these days and call them a High Elf, and that would be it. So I don't necessarily think adding High Elves to the modern game would be a good idea, but that could be the sort of thing that would absolutely fit very well inside the classic sort of paradigm, the classic era, in this sense. I'm trying to avoid using the word era because, again, classic era means something else at this point, but to fit inside of the classic environment, there we go, that will work. I think adding something like High Elves would make sense. Adding something like Goblins, but not necessarily Worgen, because, timelines being different and all that, or time frames being different and all that. You see tons of Goblin going around. Actually, no, I kind of take that back. I think Worgen would be fine as well for the classic environment. The other question to ask specifically about races here is, what are those player models? What do those actually look like? And I think we're going to get into, as I recall, one of the later, actually, no. Okay. There is not on this list the concept of player models. So I'm going to just talk about the concept of player models here because this is one that comes up a whole bunch. I hope that I'm not getting that incorrect, because I seem to remember when I was going through this on stream, I seem to remember talking about player models for a little bit. But anyway, I think what player models these races would have would be very important, because a lot of people will say, like, should they bring the modern player models into classic? And to me, the answer is no. To me, just taking the modern game player models and putting them in classic, I would not want to see that myself specifically. If it's an option that you can toggle on or off, then it's kind of whatever. Like, it wouldn't affect me. You could just be like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to leave that turned off. But the biggest reason that I would not want that turned on is because there's a different feel to the modern player models. There's a different feel to how they work entirely, especially when they're animations, like moving around. The way that they go through the different animations just feels very different to me in a way that feels inauthentic to the nature of everything else that's going on in classic. Classic animations are very stiff. There's very little like expression. They're not super expressive at all. They're not super animated. Literally, all of the animations are very stiff. To me, the modern player models would feel very out of place inside classic, to the point that it would be immersion breaking for me, which is why I would leave that off. Again, if it was just an option, I don't care. If you want them on, sure, whatever. But I would generally leave that off. I also think that there's probably some technical reasons why making that a toggle would actually be difficult, but it's hard to describe exactly what I mean by that. It comes down to animations for different spells, and especially if they start adding new spells to classic and whatever. Anyway, so that's generally my thought on races. Classes is much the same way. I don't feel like Evoker coming back would make sense. They could pull back Monk. They could pull back Death Knight. Both of those would kind of work. Monk would basically have to be redone from the ground up. Death Knight would have to be significantly adjusted as well to fit into the way the old talent trees work. Less work for Death Knight. You'd just end up pruning a bunch of talents and like slimming things down, slimming the trees down a bunch, or merging a bunch of talents and stuff like that. But Monk never existed inside of an environment where there was the point-based talent trees up until Dragonflight. So, and even then, the Dragonflight talent trees are very different from the old like classic talent tree style. So, Monk would basically need to be redone. Death Knight, I think, could work, but also at the same time, like, again, I think the idea of let's explore some new concepts. Let's come up with some new ideas for classes that could work inside of classic that we wouldn't necessarily explore otherwise. Like in the modern game, in The War Within, for example, there's a hero talent tree called Dark Ranger, which means we can probably assume there is never going to be, at least not anytime soon, there's going to be a Dark Ranger class inside of the modern World of Warcraft archetype. But that is the sort of thing that could make sense for a classic environment, where they could say, okay, here's a Dark Ranger. Yes, they use a bow. Yes, they use a gun, and they're similar to hunters in that sense. But here's all the different things they do. They're much more spell focused. They're Maybe their minions are more temporary than permanent, stuff like that. Like there's a lot of different ways that a Dark Ranger class could be implemented inside of the concept of Classic that doesn't step on anything else because they haven't implemented it in some other way. Like if you remember when Legion added Demon Hunters, quite famously, there was a Q&A that Ian and I were doing where the question came up, like, what's going on with demonology? And Ian was like, because we don't want you playing demonology. And then it was later revealed that the reason they didn't want you playing demonology was because they were going to have to redo it a whole lot in order to allow demon hunters to exist as a class, because so much of the demonology warlock class fantasy had been built around this concept, at the time at least, had been built around metamorphosis and things that were then stereotypically demon hunter abilities. They needed to pull those away from the warlock and give them to the actual demon hunter class. That's the sort of thing that needs to be avoided in the modern game and needs to be avoided in Classic as well. But there's less issues with that sort of thing in Classic because a lot of that stuff has not been implemented as of yet. So I think there's lots of angles to explore for new classes that could exist inside of the Classic archetype that wouldn't make sense to add to the modern game, but would make sense when these other things don't already exist. All right, next one on the list, they talk about minor class changes. And the description is slight modifications to class spells and abilities. And I think I'm generally okay with the idea of minor class change. In fact, I encourage some minor class changes. Things like I've been playing a druid for the majority of SOD at this point. And one of the changes that they made was taking there's a talent, I forget the name of it, it's like Natural Instincts or something like that, that's relatively towards the top of the balance tree, that previously was just 10% physical damage. Having balance have a physical damage bonus was just weird. So at some point in SOD, I believe it was in phase 3, they changed that to be all damage instead. It just increases all damage that you deal by 10%. So that way balanced druids, and this was like necessary for Omen of Clarity also, which is very important for all druids essentially, but very important for balance as well. So it was weird that you had to put 5 talent points into increasing your physical damage by 10% so that then you could get this other spell. It basically meant that Omen of Clarity was a 6 cost talent, which was weird. So they changed that to be something that increases all of your damage by 10% instead of just your physical damage, and then balanced around that otherwise. Those are the sorts of changes that I'm absolutely in favor of. I think there are cases where Classic talent design was just weird, and there were some just strange choices made with how those talent trees were put together all back in the day. Same with classes. There are just some strange choices, like why is Entangling Roots only usable outdoors? It feels like flavor, but it's flavor that isn't fun to me. I would rather be, especially when you're like inside of a place. It is crazy to me that a druid cannot use Entangling Roots inside of Razorfen Crawl, where there's roots everywhere. Like that's just funny to me. Like there's roots all over the place. Oh, but there's no roots here. You can't do this spell. So those sorts of changes are the sorts of things that I'm absolutely in favor of. The terms slight or minor tend to be pretty subjective. What one player considers to be a slight or minor change, another player may consider to be a major change. So I think no matter what, when it comes to class changes, it will come down to less of a question of like, are you okay with class changes, yes or no? And more of a question of, are you okay with this specific class change, and done on a case-by-case basis? That's just sort of how I feel about class changes in Classic in general. I'm okay with some that are just quality of life, essentially, or just fixing things up a little bit. But I would want to steer away from things that change the way the class plays in any substantial category. We're going to do the next couple together as well. This is returning player re-entry feature, which would be providing an easy onboarding experience for returning players, or a new player experience, which provides an easy onboarding experience for new players. So the concept of someone coming back to Classic, it's not clear what they're saying coming back to Classic from. Like, is this a returning player who played Cataclysm back in, what was that, 2009, 2010, whenever Cataclysm came out, and now is coming back to Cataclysm Classic in this day and age? Are we talking about someone who is playing Dragonflight right now and they're quote unquote returning to Classic era? There's a lot that is kind of open-ended about that question. And the same for a new player experience. Like, is it a new player just to Season of Discovery? Is it a new player just to the concept of Classic? Or is it a new player to World of Warcraft entirely? Is it a new player to MMOs entirely? There's a lot of like different ways that this can be taken, but I think my answer to this is pretty much the same either way. I would be very, very cautious about any of this, and I wouldn't want anything to be done that changes in any substantial way any of the existing like entry level content in in World of Warcraft Classic, even in Season of Discovery, to be honest. I wouldn't want them to go through and redo all of the starting zones, as an example. So there's two concepts I can see for a way that this could work, that would be beneficial and would be things that I'd be okay with. There's a heavy-handed approach and a much more lighter touch approach. The lighter touch approach would just literally be updating some of the quest text in those early zones, saying things like for example, you're picking cactus apples inside the Valley of Trials. Have a bit in the quest text that says, look for cactus apples around and right click on them to collect them. Like just little things that give you more of a direct understanding of exactly what you need to do. Similar for like the quest that you get that sends you to your class trainer for the first time. Put some text in there that says things like, once you're at your class trainer, here's how it works. Here's how you get new spells. Here's how spell ranks work and stuff like that. And put all that information inside of those quests. So at the very least, the player can then, if they're brand new to World of Warcraft, they're brand new to Classic. Maybe they played World of Warcraft post Mists of Pandaria, but they've never experienced spell ranks before. They never experienced having to purchase your spells before. Giving something that gives them a little bit of a thing. And then maybe putting that information, if you go back to your class trainer, give them some dialogue options that explain a bunch of this stuff as well. Those sorts of things I think would be fine. That would be a much more lighter touch approach. It's literally just giving a little bit more of a tutorialization text to the quests that already exist that are meant to be something of a tutorial. The heavy-handed approach that I could see for something like this, if they wanted to go as far as being like, all right, we're going to do the classic version of Exile's Reach. We're going to do the classic version of you're going to make a character and you are going to go through a heavily tutorialized start to finish experience that handholds you the whole way through and tells you everything that you're going to do and so on. If they wanted to go as far as putting you on an island somewhere and just straight up holding your hand all the way through how to do things in World of Warcraft, I could see that working, but with one very important caveat, that I don't think that character should continue to exist beyond that tutorial. Okay, I think if you're going to make this tutorialized experience, it should be a one-off character that never really even exists in the first place. Like if you go so far as to say, if you log off in the middle of it, maybe you have to start the whole thing over again. I don't know. There's probably ways to save that concept, but I don't think this should then be a character that exists on your character select screen. I would be okay with this in the sense of like, okay, here is a straight up tutorial experience that's going to teach you how to play this video game. And then after you're done with this, then you get to go and make your character and start from level 1 with 0 experience points and go up from there. That I think could work. That would be pretty cool, actually. And I think a lot of MMOs would benefit from something like that as like before you even choose your class, here, understand what this is. And that would also give them the opportunity to be like, okay, we're going to let you try out what a few different classes feel like just by changing your character and changing what spells you have on your character. Here, now you have like Corruption and Shadow Bolt. Experience what it's like to be a warlock for a second. Okay, that's what a warlock is. Now let's give you, I don't know, Smite and Holy Fire. Now you're a holy priest that's DPS for some reason. I don't know why those were the examples that came to mind. Let's give you Flash Heal and Renew. Now you understand what it is to be a healing priest. Let's give you Revenge and Shield Slam. Now you understand what it's like to be a protection warrior. That sort of thing that would allow you to get a taste of what the different gameplay elements are like and get a little bit of an idea of what the game plays like before then going into, okay, you've completed this tutorial experience. We've given you the information you need to make an informed decision about what class you want to play. And then you get to start your journey as a player. I think that as an optional thing that is probably presented to players primarily who don't have a character already, that would be cool. That would be a great idea for Classic, especially because, again, there's a lot of things that exist in Classic that are very old and outdated concepts. Things like spell ranks existing, things like having to go to your trainer to train your spells, things like the way that respecs work and so on. Those are things that only really exist inside Classic and haven't been a thing in the modern game for a long time. I think something like that would be good. I really feel very strongly that should not be something where the character that you're going through this tutorial experience with is your character. It should be something that you're like, okay, I would like to do the tutorial. You don't make a character. I would like to do the tutorial. Maybe you pick like a race and like model type to go through the tutorial with, but that's it. Then you go through and it's like, okay, here's your stuff and blah, blah, blah. And you're done. That I think could work. But again, I probably, that sounds like a lot of work. That sounds like a lot of like technical stuff to try to get done right. The much lighter touch approach is the more practical way to do this, where it's just literally add some dialogue text to things so that you have the option to read about how you're supposed to be playing the video game as you're going through your first few quests. That would work as well. What I don't want is let's overhaul all of the starting zones to make them a more tutorialized experience, because that content, I feel very strongly that that content should continue to exist the way that it does. We're going to kind of lightning round the next few of these because I just don't have a lot to say on most of them. The next one is new group events and rewards. It just says new group events or scenarios with unique rewards. Okay, cool. New group events or rewards. That is such a broad topic that sure, yeah, if I'm okay with new dungeons and raids, then how could I not be okay with new group events and rewards? Now, you can infer from the fact that this is listed separately that they're probably talking about things like what they've done in SOD with like the incursions and so on. They're probably talking about stuff like that. I don't have a problem with it. To me, if you're okay with new dungeons, you should be okay with new group events as well. So that should be fine. Ongoing class tuning and polish, which they defined as continuously refining the various classes through player feedback and in-game data. I'm a no on this one to an extent. I think there is some need for, let me rephrase this actually. I'm a no for making this a permanent fixture in someone's work schedule. I would not want it to be the case that there is someone whose job is on a weekly basis. What you have to do is tune classes, because that leads into someone who is now tuning classes just for the sake of tuning classes because that's their job. I think this is the sort of thing that if they were to assign it to someone who is maybe on the class or rune or whatever design team, and they're part of that group that's working on that aspect of the game in Classic, but it's not something that they need to be necessarily checking off of their to-do list every week, that's fine. Excuse me, looking at things where it's like, okay, it turns out that warriors are the only DPS anyone ever wants to play because they're the ones that do the most damage, and there's no reason to ever bring any DPS other than a warrior unless you need their specific buffs or whatever. Like you got a shaman for Wind Fury Totem and then 4 warriors in the group. That sort of level of stuff, like that to me is something where it's like, okay, yeah, it's fine to look at that and say, let's do some tuning changes. Again, not in the original Classic era, that should stay untouched. But it's fine to me in the concept of a Classic Plus to want to do some tuning changes so that other classes have the opportunity to ever really get played in that sense. That's the sort of stuff that I think is fine. When there's extreme outliers, yes, step in and make some tuning changes for that effect. But I don't think that they should go as far as saying on a weekly basis, let's just make sure that we're constantly refining things and we're constantly adjusting things and making tuning changes every single week for Classic. And the reason that I say that is because eventually it just leads to the point of making changes for the sake of it was this person's job to make some changes. It eventually leads to a point where you're constantly adjusting things because you feel like you need to be constantly adjusting things because that is on your list of tasks to check off for the week. Did I make some tuning changes to improve class balance overall? And I don't think it should ever get to that point. I think it's fine for there to be some little changes that are made here and there, or some changes that are made to, like, just for the overall health of the game, make sure that there are the option for other classes to be played. That's good stuff. But I don't think they should ever be aiming for perfect balance inside the Classic archetype. I said that we were going to lightning round these, and then I immediately talked at length about class tuning and polish. I kind of forgot that I had so much to say about that one, but we're going to go through a couple more of them here. Guild Bank, introducing a Guild Bank feature to Classic era. Yes, I literally see 0 downsides to introducing a Guild Bank. It just literally saves somebody from logging on to an alt, and it also saves people from feeling like they should multi-box to be able to access said alt, or not multi-box, account share to be able to access said vault. So just put the Guild Bank in. I don't see any downside to it. The collection UI, introducing a collections user interface feature to access mounts, toys, and companions to Classic era. Again, I don't see any downsides to this at all. Not having your mount sitting in your inventory, not having your favorite pets sitting in your inventory makes those things much more accessible. There's possibly some questions to ask about this of, if you make it so that pets don't take inventory space, do you then just start seeing a lot of people with pets around them constantly? Like, is that just going to massively increase the number of non-combat pets you're seeing in the world? But I don't think that's a bad thing either. Like, I think that's fine if everyone has their little like rat or cockroach or whatever chasing them around. Like, that's fine. That's not a problem. So to me, both of those are pretty obvious. Like, yeah, just go ahead and do it. And then dual talent specialization. Again, this one says introducing the ability to switch between 2 talent specializations to Classic era. I think for Classic era, the like archive realm, no, don't do that. Don't touch Classic era as it exists. Aside from little changes like quality of life changes. I don't consider this to be a quality of life change because I think that dual talent specialization creates a style of gameplay in which you would have someone like a druid, for example. You could have a balanced druid who then swaps to bear, and that's literally part of your raid composition, is that you have this DPS switches to a tank spec, and like the same could go for a warrior. You have a warrior who's fully DPS focused and then swaps to a full protection spec for 4 horsemen or whatever, and they just can swap back and forth like that. That adjusts and changes the way that you actually approach the content, having dual talent specialization available. I think for SOD, it was a very good addition. And I think for Classic Plus, it would be a very good addition. So I'm very much in favor of dual talent spec coming into the game. But I think for Classic Era, the sort of museum realm that I keep referring to it as, I think it changes the way you approach the game too much to include in that sort of thing as a quality of life change. New/future class and race combinations. So this is not adding new classes or races. This is allowing races to be classes that they couldn't be previously. And this one I'm very much in favor of. I honestly, like in this day and age, I don't see the need for racial restrictions on classes in a pretty general, broad sense. There's probably some races that it just wouldn't make, like an undead druid might be weird from the concept of like, this is something who is an abomination of life. How are they doing life things? But then again, they can be holy priests. So who knows? And undead is honestly kind of the only real outlier here of something like, why would a Tauren mage not exist? If Tauren can be druids, why can't they be mages, right? If they can get in touch with this style of magic, why can't they get in touch with this style of magic? Night elf mages, why don't those exist? Dwarven mages existed in the original class, or the original beta for the old game way back in the day, and were removed for some reason going into the release of World of Warcraft in 2004. I think a lot of these class and race combinations would be completely and totally fine. I don't see a reason to keep restricting things in such a sense. If you want to be a gnome hunter, sure, go for it. Improved social features. It says implementation of updated social systems, e.g. global chats, guilds, pre-made groups, etc. This one I'm kind of torn on. Philosophically, I don't have a problem with the idea of making communication easier for players. I don't really have an issue with that. But I also really don't like that SOD now has the modern guild interface in it. And it might just be because it's different, but I don't like it. It was really jarring to me when I saw that in there. It just feels weird to me. And it's a little bit weird too, because it like lets you access like Battle.net groups and stuff like that, but you can't actually do anything with those because there's nothing cross realm. There's nothing cross faction in SOD. So that's a little bit weird. I wouldn't mind the idea of some of these systems being updated with like actually a new functionality that fits the classic vibe directly. I don't necessarily think pulling modern stuff into classic, it doesn't necessarily directly fit. But I don't know. That's why I'm a little bit torn on this one. I feel like there's some aspects of that stuff that would be good. There's some aspects of that stuff that doesn't really fit the way that classic works. And then things like, obviously, people are going to talk about things like Dungeon Finder. I don't consider that to be a social feature, I guess, but I guess it kind of is in some senses. I don't think Dungeon Finder should ever make its way into classic. I think having to look for group members is a big part of the classic experience. And whether that's good or bad is almost irrelevant at that point. That's how classic plays, and I think it's important that it stays that way. I would like to see the meeting stones actually become functional and allow you to use those to list yourself as like there was a version. This is why the meeting stones are even clickable in the first place, or like light up when you put your cursor over them. There was a version where you clicked on that and then you just listed yourself as saying, yes, I would like to do this. Or you'd have a group and you would click on that and you'd list yourself as, yes, I'd have to do this. But you had to actually travel to the meeting stone and click on it in order to find a group for the thing. I wouldn't be opposed to a version of that existing. Heck, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to a version of the pre-made group finder from Modern making its way into a version of Classic either. So many people are using there's an add-on that like basically just aggregates the LFG channel so it's actually readable. So many people are using that already anyway that they might as well just put something in that makes that system less of a let's parse a chat channel constantly sort of thing and just makes it an actual proper system. That sort of thing I would be totally okay with. Again, I don't want random matchmaking to be part of the PvE experience at the very least inside Classic. Which brings us to the last one on the list, which is PvP honor system improvements. It says provide a more granular, real-time PvP honor system with better progress tracking. And when I was talking about this one on stream, when this was first sent to me, the idea that I sort of hit on there was I'm okay with a new honor system being added. I'm okay with another layer on top of the existing system being added, something that's separate from that, but still progresses through PvP. I think having something where you earn honor points or some other currency that then can go towards buying your gear and so on, instead of having that purely be based on your rank, I think I'd be okay with that. But I think the rank stuff needs to continue to exist, and it needs to continue to exist in the way that it currently does. I would want someone who has the, Grand Marshal title or whatever. That should be an indicator of, yes, this person has spent a lot of time just engaged in PvP and earning honor kills, and they've put the effort into earning this, and that can stay the same way that it is right now. That doesn't need to be tied to PvP progression in the sense of gearing and so on. So yes, add some sort of granular real-time PvP honor system, but don't necessarily change how that works for the titles and so on. Now, it's also possible, as I'm reading this, it's also possible I'm misreading and misinterpreting what they're talking about with this system. It might be that they're talking about, instead of having the ranks be something that's calculated weekly, instead have this be something that's like, okay, here is how far you made it towards the next rank, and have it be something that you can actually see your progress on a more regular basis, and maybe updates on a more regular basis, so you don't have to wait a week to find out if you got your promotion or not. That I would also be okay with in a sense. I just think that the way that ranking works in Classic should stay relatively close to how it worked back in 2004. And I should add to that, I know that there's already been a bunch of changes to specifically how it works that have been made, and a lot of that is just quality of life stuff, so that you don't have to literally be playing 24/7 to get the higher ranks. That's all fine. Like that's all. Those are all good changes that have been implemented. I just would still prefer the rank that you have and the title that you receive to be something that is pretty closely tied to the amount of PvP that you're doing, and not have that like on a regular basis. Maybe have it be something that you can eventually lose. I don't know. There's different ways that this could be implemented. Maybe actually don't make it something you could eventually lose. I don't know. I'm just spitballing a little bit here, but overall, I'm definitely in favor of the concept of PvP honor system improvements. I just don't know that it's necessarily a good idea for them to completely throw out what already exists and replace it with something new, versus letting the existing system continue to be the way that it is for things like titles, and then making something new that is as a side to that, that works for things like collecting gear. Anyway, that's all of the things that were on the list that I was sent. And I think there's a lot to think about here. There's a lot of stuff that, especially when you start to consider the average player who thinks of Classic Plus. I've always said this before. I've said this many times on the show before as well. The idea of what Classic Plus is, and the idea of what constitutes a change to the Classic experience is different from player to player. So it's generally healthy, in my opinion, to go through lists of things like this and just actually sit down and consider, like, okay, would I be okay with this change or not? Would this be something that I'm okay with? Would this be something that I'm opposed to? A lot of people are going to say no, make absolutely no changes. And I think that's fine. That's part of why I think that Classic era environment needs to continue to exist in a as close to the original as possible, again, like almost an archive or a museum piece, sort of like, this is how the game existed back in 2004. So you can go back and experience that again. It's actually very rare to be able to do that with an MMORPG. And so that's part of why I think it's so important to keep that around. And also, like I said, there's this player base that really wants that. I think that's totally fine. But for a lot of players, you might literally think that you don't want any changes made to the game. But then when someone gives a list of this like this, you go, you know what, actually that one I'd be okay with, or this would actually be good, or this might actually make the game more fun for me. So I think it's important to think about this stuff and talk about it, even if Classic Plus never comes to fruition, which at this point I would be shocked if it doesn't. But even if that never comes to be the case, it's still fun to think about, and it's still good to sort of theorize through and just have the thought exercise of going through this from a design perspective. Now then, all of that being said, let's get into some questions for this week. The first one is very related to everything that we've been talking about so far. It came in from 100 times cooler on YouTube, who said, can you talk about the recent quote unquote revert of the totally intentional changes that were introduced into Arrow Realms with the launch of SOD Phase 4? I'm of the opinion that they should keep the world buff changes around, as they're a huge quality of life with zero downside, and the change is already in the same spirit as the biggest quality of life change introduced into Era, i.e. Chronoboons. So there's a few things to dig into in this question, some of which I've already talked about. I'm not going to reiterate the whole Classic Era should stay as Classic Era thing. Again, I feel like I've done that 7 times through this episode already. So we'll just leave that as it is. I do want to point out, to be absolutely clear, though, I definitely do not think that those changes were intentional, that they made it to Classic Era. I know the way this question is phrased, it sounds like this person is saying, oh, they put in these changes on purpose, and then when a whole bunch of people reacted negatively to that, they immediately knee-jerk and reverted them. But they wanted to put those in at first. I absolutely do not think under any circumstances that it was intentional that those SOD changes made it to Classic Era. And there are 2 or 3 big reasons for that. The first one is just the way that the archetype works, the server architecture, not archetype, architecture works. Remember, you're just launching one client when you log into Season of Discovery versus Classic Era, which means that all of the changes that are actually in SOD are server side, which means they're all in server configuration stuff. There's like server flags that get set on different servers and stuff. Same way that like PvE versus PvP servers exist in Classic. And honestly, a lot of it is very similar. I imagine at the very least is very similar to how things like the Encourage War event worked way back in the day, where eventually a server would reach a point that a trigger was hit, a flag was changed, and now the Encourage War event content was turned on. All of that content existed somewhere. It just needed that flag to be on for it to activate. And thus a whole bunch of other changes occurred as a result of that. I imagine that the way that they're doing Season of Discovery is ultimately very similar, because again, you're launching the same client to go into this as you're going into Classic Era, which means that it's very, very likely that it's very possible, I should say, that what happened is the flag was just set incorrectly and some changes made it over to Classic Era because they literally just forgot to click the box that says make sure, or set the flag or whatever, that says this is only for SOD realms. It's super possible that occurred, and I think more likely that occurred than they did a stealth change to how this stuff works, because they've been pretty good about communicating when they're going to add stuff like this to Classic Era. When they're going to make a change to Classic Era, they've been pretty good about communicating that. That's the second point that I was going to get to. They didn't say anything about any of these changes coming to Classic Era in advance, and I doubt they would stealth hotfix like and just be like, haha, maybe no one will notice that we've added the Stormwind's Might buff into the Stormwind's Might world buff into Classic Era. Maybe no one will notice. Like, no, this is obviously people will notice this. Blizzard is going to communicate that sort of thing. So it's absolutely, it was not intentional. I don't think there's any reason in the slightest to believe that it was an intended, like, haha, we're just going to sneak this over onto the Classic Era realms. Very much unintentional, which is also why I think they would want to revert that. It's not meant to be there. It was an unintended ad. It's the sort of thing that then sure they can then go and ask and talk to their player base and talk to Classic Era players and be like, hey, is this something that you actually want? But given recent discourse, it sounds like the answer is they actually very much don't. A lot of people have been saying that they don't want that. And again, I actually kind of agree with that. I think that Classic Era should, with the exception of some small quality of life changes, should not be like things like the Chronoboon, should not be messed with too much. Now, as to the world buff changes itself, the idea of adding Stormwind's Might to Classic Era, I honestly, I can't really, like, I don't play Classic Era. I don't actually want to play Classic Era. It's a game that I played it a bunch when it first came out in 2019, and I had my little nostalgia trip, and then I was like, okay, I am now satisfied with Classic Era, and I don't have any interest in getting to level 60 and doing 40 player rating, so I'm just not going to do that. Like, it was something that I just decided, yep, I loved this game back in 2004. I've had my good nostalgia trip playing Classic in 2019. That's not what I want to do. This is why I gravitate towards Season of Discovery instead of to Classic Era. So I can't really comment on whether or not that would be a good change to include or not in Classic Era, because it's not a game that it's a horse that I have no race in. Other way around. It's a race that I have no horse in. Good Lord. I personally, I don't see a problem with adding Stormwind's Might into the game, but I could see that being something that then makes a whole lot of guilds question, like, oh, should we now re-roll back to Alliance? Is this going to change the guild like structure? Is this going to change the guild rankings? Are there Alliance guilds that now that they have access to Stormwind's Might are now going to be able to progress faster or get better parses or whatever? Like, there's a lot of potential ramifications from a change like that just going in, much more than the change with the Chrono Boon, where it was like, this literally just keeps you from having to log off until raid time. Chrono Boon was a change that went in specifically to allow you to continue playing the game as normal outside of raid time, so that you don't have to worry about losing your buffs, so that you can then get your parses and so on once it's actually raid time. That's all that Chrono Boon did. Giving an extra world buff to an entire faction, again, I don't personally see a problem with it, but it does mean that there's going to be some social ramifications as a result of that, where different guilds have to consider what does this actually mean that we do, so on and so forth. So that's the sort of thing that should absolutely be communicated well in advance before just accidentally springing it onto the Classic Era servers. So again, I'm not going to say which one that I think is the correct way to go for Classic Era, because I don't know. I don't play Classic Era. I'm not a part of that community really. And I don't really get that vibe. So I don't really feel that vibe, I guess I should say. So that's for people that aren't me to make a decision on. Anyway, let's move on. Next question comes from Dead and Cold on YouTube, who asked, what are your opinions and predictions on the mobility of traditional gaming? The Switch, PS Portal, Steam Deck, and all its clones, etc., all untether you from your couch or PC desk. Is this option an important part of the future of gaming, or is it just a fad? So to start off, I think the concept of is mobile gaming a fad is that it absolutely is very clearly not. It's existed for a long time. Like the Game Boy, the original Game Boy came out in, I don't know, the 80s, I think, maybe the 90s. I don't remember. It was a long time ago that the original Game Boy came out. Long enough ago that I remember wanting one when I was a child. So there we go. So the mobile game, and it wasn't, to be clear, the Game Boy also was not the first handheld gaming device. There were these things called LCD games that existed prior to that even. So I'm old. Anyway, I don't think mobile gaming or mobility in gaming is a fad whatsoever. The real question is, at what point will the ability to play games on mobile, or will ever the ability to play games on mobile or in a mobile environment, supplant or replace the desire to play them while sitting at a computer or sitting at a couch? And that one, I don't think that will ever really happen. Even if it's like the case where you're still sitting on a couch holding a handheld device, like the experience of holding a Steam Deck and playing something like, I don't know, God of War, the experience of holding a Steam Deck and playing God of War versus sitting on a couch with a controller with your big stereo system around you playing something like God of War, or sitting at your PC with your mouse and keyboard playing something like God of War. Those are all different experiences, and people are going to gravitate towards different things. I think increasingly in the modern world, mobile gaming is starting to overtake, because a lot of like Gen Z and even some Gen Y, millennial, whatever you want to call it at this point, the in-between generations, a lot of these are people that grew up playing nothing but handheld games. They grew up, they were an iPad kid. They grew up with an iPad and they were playing mobile games on that. And as they got older, they grew into playing things on like their Switch, or maybe nowadays they're growing up playing on a Steam Deck and so on. And now they're getting to the point where that's just how they prefer to play video games. Like the younger generations, younger than myself at least, generations, a lot of them grew up like that. And that's just how they like to play video games as a result. So I definitely think it's something that as time goes on and as mobile devices become more powerful and the ability to have that sort of rich, deep gaming experience on a mobile device becomes more common, it's the sort of thing we're going to see a lot more of. Do I think it's ever going to replace, sitting on a couch with your PlayStation controller, kick back in your recliner, playing something on there? I don't think it'll ever replace that necessarily. I don't think it's going to replace like PC gaming with like mouse and keyboard first person shooter sort of stuff, or like high reaction time gaming and stuff like that. I don't think it'll really replace it. The other sort of question that should be asked as part of this, though, is how much more Switch-like are we going to start seeing systems become as time goes on? Because to me, one of the big downfalls of the Steam Deck, and I do own a Steam Deck, but one of the big downfalls of the Steam Deck is that it doesn't have the ability, at least natively, for me to put it in a dock that is connected to a mouse and keyboard and monitor and just be like, plug it in, and now I'm playing the same game I was just playing over here instead. If it had that ability, and there are ways to do that, to be clear, there are ways to do it. There are adapters, like mostly third-party adapters, that you can get that will allow you to set that sort of system up, and that's super cool. It's just not something that is fully supported by Steam or the Steam Deck, and as such is not really, not the same way that it exists for the Switch, where the Switch like actively encourages you, like you were playing this game on your Switch on your like Metro ride home. You get home, You walk home from the train station, you get home, you plug your Switch into the dock that's sitting next to your TV, you pick up your Pro controller, and now you're continuing your gaming session now sitting on your couch in front of your TV. Like, that is something that was part of the original advertisement campaign for the Switch. That is the experience that they want you to understand. I would like to see things like the Steam Deck and other similar things pursue more of that sort of angle in the future, to where you can actually treat something like a Steam Deck as your primary gaming rig instead of a way to play the games that you would normally be playing on your PC, but playing them somewhere else. And I think that's something that the Steam Deck has kind of missed on. Again, it's totally possible to do. It's just not something that they really advertise. And there's some good reasons for that. The Steam Deck, despite being a very, very cool piece of hardware, it's a little bit behind in terms of technology. If you were using a Steam Deck as your primary gaming PC, you would be playing a lot of things on low or medium quality at best. Like, you're not going to get high frame rates out of it. You're not going to get the best graphics ever out of it. That's just kind of how it is. I have in the past set it up in such a way where I was using a mouse and keyboard to play stuff on my Steam Deck, and it worked, but it was like, that's about the best that I could describe it, is that it worked. That's about it. It wasn't something that I would ever really want to do. But again, maybe that's just from my perspective as someone who owns a gaming PC. But anyway, yeah, no, I think traditional gaming and mobile gaming are starting to overlap a lot more than they have in the past. I don't think mobile gaming is in any way a fad. I think if anything, what's going to happen is we're going to start seeing more and more and more advances in mobile gaming, and like handheld gaming specifically. Because again, that's what a lot of the modern generation is accustomed to. That's what they consider to be playing a video game, is to have something in your hand that you are then playing, as opposed to sitting in front of a couch, sitting in front of a TV screen, sitting in front of a monitor, sitting in front of a couch, sitting on a couch in front of a TV screen is what I meant to say. That's just naturally, as time goes on, that will be what people consider to be gaming. So that will be something that is then invested in more, because they're wanting to cater to that target audience as much as they can. And that's not to say, by the way, just to be clear, that's not to say that modern gamers and younger gamers don't also like to have a controller in their hand, or they don't also like to play on a PC. Like, that's not at all the case. It's just that there are more people of that generation who that is their gaming experience than there have been in previous generations. That's all I'm trying to say there. Anyway, hopefully that answers that question. I'm going to wrap things up for today. Thank you all so much for watching and or listening. Really appreciate it. Reminder, if you have a question you'd like to see answered here on the show, or if you just have a topic in mind that you'd love to hear me ramble my thoughts about, I would love to know about it. Please leave a comment below on YouTube, or you can head over to Patreon if you're a patron. Head over there, and there will be a link to a form inside the description for this episode that you can fill out, because patrons do get priority on having their questions answered here on the show. So you can head over there and fill out that form, and I will make sure to get to your question. Also, if you haven't checked out my Patreon yet, please do check it out. It is patreon.com/Devilor. You can check that out. We have a bunch of cool perks, including the one I just mentioned, where patrons get a priority access to having their questions answered. But also you get every episode a little bit sooner. You get it ad free because you can watch it directly on Patreon. You can, there's a whole bunch of other little perks. They're all listed out on Patreon. So please do go and check that out. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling. Thank you all so much once again for being here, and I'll see you later.